Okay, things get a little bit more complicated for us in exercises 14 and 15 here because we have 5 different streptococcus that we're trying to distinguish between. Like the staphylococcus, streptococcus are gram-positive, as you can see by their purple color in this gram stain. They are more often going to be arranged in chains. And that's not always obvious. Some streps make these beautiful long chains. Some streps only pair up, what we would call diplococci. But if you see, again, these long chains, that's a pretty good hint that you have a streptococcus of some kind. Now, this chaining typically only shows up if you do a gram stain from a broth. Okay, if you take your cells from a plate, you're not likely to see these long chains. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That's one of the reasons that we like for you, when you do your gram stain as part of your unknown, we like for you, if possible, to take a look at it from a broth. All right, some more characteristics of Streptococcus. Okay, they are catalase negative. Talked about that enzyme last time. They actually use a different enzyme to detoxify hydrogen peroxide, and that's called peroxidase. Okay, so they're positive for peroxidase. Incidentally, and I don't think this equation is anywhere in your lab book. Keep goofing that up there. What does peroxidase do? Again, let's try again there. I'm not as familiar with this equation. It uses an electron carrier to detoxify that hydrogen peroxide. Okay, so we get the oxidized portion. This NADH becomes oxidized, and we end up with water rather than hydrogen peroxide. Okay, so if there is a test for peroxidase, I'm not really sure how you would test for either one of these end products. There may be a way to do it. It's much easier to test for catalase. And if catalase is negative and it's an organism that, can tolerate hydrogen peroxide, then it's probably peroxidase positive. Okay, so because the organism can detoxify, that toxic byproduct of aerobic respiration, we consider them either facultative anaerobes, or there's some variation here. Again, it's a pretty big group, big genera. I don't have a number as to how many organisms are in it. Some of them are considered facultative anaerobes, and some of them are actually considered aerotolerant anaerobes. And there may be some strict anaerobes in there too. I'm not really sure. Okay, most of our streps are actually only do fermentation. Okay, they are what's called homolactive. They actually only do the fermentation pathway where you get lactic acid. Okay, so that may seem odd that we consider them facultative anaerobes if they don't respire aerobically. There's some nuance here, okay? So the reason that we call them facultative anaerobes or aerotolerant anaerobes when they don't even do aerobic respiration is because some of them actually produce certain virulence factors. They're only expressed in aerobic environments. Okay, so a virulence factor, like one that helps them to adhere to cells that they would want to infect. Okay, and without those virulence factors, they aren't going to be as successful as forming an infection. Okay, so they are more likely to survive in the presence of oxygen because that virulence factor is produced. So again, a little nuance there. Some of them are considered capnophiles. And that means that they are going to grow best in a little higher concentration of carbon dioxide. Okay, so when we put the brackets around it, that means concentration. Okay, so how do we provide a high carbon dioxide environment for our streps? So we could grow them in a CO2 incubator. And we actually have one of those over in the other lab. It's very small. It's big enough to put all our stock plates in it, but it's not big enough for all of our student plates. So we have a little lower tech solution. Let's do this. Or grow it in a candle jar. Okay, so here's a picture of a candle jar. Used to be some kind of pickle jar or something, but we've converted it in the name of science. So once you inoculate your plate today, instead of putting them in a rack and me putting them in the incubator, you will stack them up in a big jar like this. And once everybody's plate is in there, I will light a little votive candle in there and put the lid on tight. Okay, so once the amount of oxygen decreases in the jar, okay, the light will go out. Okay, you know that flames need oxygen to burn. So yes, there is less oxygen in that candle jar, but what we are most interested in, though, is that CO2 is a product of combustion. Okay, so in the maybe 20 or 30 seconds that flame is burning, it's putting out some CO2, okay, and so our streps, who are kind of picky about growing sometimes, are more likely to grow. Okay, so we always, if possible, are going to incubate our streps in a high CO2 environment, again, in a candle jar. Okay, big thing to note here is that staphs also grow fine in a candle jar. Okay, and that's highlighted in your lab book as well. So the importance of that is when it's time to do your unknown and you don't know what kind of gram-positive you have growing on your plate, if you don't know if you have staph or strep, then you're going to want to put it in a candle jar, because the staphs, they don't really care one way or the other. Okay, they're so flexible, they can grow in CO2, they can grow without it. Okay, but your streps are not going to grow as well unless they are in a candle jar. Okay, so let's talk about our 5 streps individually. We're going to spend the most time here on our first one, Streptococcus Pyogenes, because it's probably, in my mind, the most interesting. Okay, so first of all, spelling. A lot of students want to put an R in here and make it Pyrogenes. That prefix pyro means heat-inducing, which it's true this organism, if you have an infection, is typically going to cause a fever, but this prefix pyo means pus-inducing. So if you've ever had strep throat, for example, you might get these pussy pockets on your tonsils. So anyway, no R in there. Lots of infections caused by Streptococcus Pyogenes. We can kind of split this up into groups. One group is considered soft tissue infections, and that just means the microbial invasion of the skin and layers directly underneath. Okay, so like I mentioned, probably the most common, or one that you've heard of the most, soft tissue infection of Strep Pyogenes would be Strep Throat. Okay, some people seem to be seem to get this more commonly than others. I get it all the time. My son that's 20, I don't think he's ever had it. Okay, so we don't really know why that is, but if you have a super tender, painful sore throat accompanied with a fever, of course, that may not be strep throat. It could be caused by something viral. But if you go to the doctor and they, do the strep test and it comes back positive, then you have a Strep Pyogenes infection. That's the organism that causes strep throat. Okay, and you don't want to mess around with that. You want to get that treated. I see on Facebook where people want to just, gargle with vinegar to take care of strep throat. Don't mess around with that because I understand that people want to take antibiotics as less frequently as possible, and there may be good reasons for that, but you want to treat a strep throat infection because there are some strains of Strep Pyogenes that cause strep throat that can produce this erythrogenic toxin that causes a bright red rash. Okay, so strep throat can turn into, an untreated strep throat can turn into an infection known as scarlet fever. Okay, and that infection is not as common today as it was around the turn of the last century, the early 1900s, although I was just reading about this, in England, scarlet fever has reached the highest number of cases in over 50 years. So they've had over 19,000 cases in 2016, and mostly in kids under the age of 10. So again, this is still very treatable with antibiotics, and certainly you break out in a rash like that, you usually have a bright red, they call it strawberry tongue. Patients are absolutely miserable. Certainly you're going to seek some medical attention for that and get it treated. But again, potentially serious infection, especially in children, because there are some complications associated with that we'll get to in a minute. Other soft tissue infections, impetigo, we talked about that as being also caused by Staph aureus. It presents in a very similar way when it's caused by Strep Pyogenes. And then probably the most serious infection here, necrotizing fasciitis, also known as the strep flesh-eating disease. Okay, so thankfully strains of Strep Pyogenes that cause this are pretty rare, although I've talked to students that have treated patients and seen patients like this in the hospital. Mortality of about 50%. So it's the organism is just so fast growing that the only way doctors have to keep ahead of that is to cut out the infected tissue. It infects the fascia, which is kind of what holds all your internal organs together. Basically have to, again, cut out infected tissue, and that leaves patients, wide open to all sorts of other kinds of infections. So very serious, again, luckily fairly rare. Some toxigenic infections. So these are strains of Strep Pyogenes that are particularly good at producing toxins. This organism can also cause a form of toxic shock syndrome. So again, some similarities with Staph aureus. We talked about that last time. And then there are some autoimmune problems that Strep Pyogenes can cause. I mentioned before, really important to treat a strep throat if you have strep throat. Not only so it doesn't turn into scarlet fever, but also there are autoimmune complications of an untreated strep throat. Antibodies that target the antigens on the surface of Strep Pyogenes can cross-react with our self-antigens, and most commonly ones in the kidneys or ones in the heart valve. So we can get things like rheumatic fever as a complication, again, of strep throat, or if someone, say, takes antibiotics for a few days and then stops, an incompletely treated strep throat. Okay, so before antibiotics, this was fairly common. You would have known somebody that had rheumatic fever as a result of strep throat, and this could result in permanent heart valve damage. Okay, so this was a huge problem. If those antibodies attack our kidneys instead of the Strep Pyogenes, that's an autoimmune complication called post-infectious glomerulonephritis. It's kind of a mouthful. Okay, one of our instructors in BMS, he's not here anymore, but every time he got strep throat, it would land him in the emergency room with kidney problems. So even though he treated the strep throat, he would often have this autoimmune complication of a Strep Pyogenes infection. And again, this is potentially serious. Anything that causes your kidneys to shut down is not good. Okay, so that's maybe more than you wanted to know about Strep Pyogenes. I won't spend as much time on our other streps. Strep agalactiae. Okay, about 30% of women have Strep agalactiae as part of their normal microbiota vaginally. And that's really no problem at all unless they become pregnant and their babies pick up that organism during birth. Okay, so the big clinical interest here is that it can cause a neonatal meningitis. Okay. Now, the incidence of this goes way down with good prenatal care because women near the end of their second trimester or the beginning of their third, I forget, are tested for what they call Group B strep. And we're going to talk about what that grouping system refers to in a minute, but Strep agalactiae is in this Group B of our strep. So if you've ever had a kid and had a Group B test, they were testing for Strep agalactiae. If women are carriers of this organism, they're given antibiotics at some point before or maybe even during birth so that their babies don't get this potentially very serious infection. Okay, let's see, Strep Pneumoniae. Okay, this is an organism that used to be referred to as pneumococcus. We're constantly kind of changing names and shifting our classification and taxonomy around a little bit, but now it's called Streptococcus Pneumoniae. And like you would guess, this is a major cause of pneumonia, especially a problem in elderly people and very young people. It's actually the #1 cause of bacterial pneumonia. It can also cause other things like ear infections as well as meningitis. Okay, meningitis is an infection of the meninges. That's that covering of the spinal cord and the brain. So very, very serious. We do have a pneumococcus vaccine now that young children are given. So hopefully that will also cut down on the ear infections as well as protect them from the even more serious meningitis and pneumonia. Okay, Strep Midas. Okay, this one not as much of a problem clinically. It's part of our normal microbiota in the mouth. All right, so it's one of those organisms that contributes to our tooth decay, to dental caries. All right, makes a nice thick capsule in order to stick to our teeth so it doesn't get washed down into the digestive tract. Okay, and I forgot to mention that the Strep Pneumoniae, this is our organism that's a true capnophile. Okay, so that organism does not grow well unless we have that in a candle jar. Okay, and lastly, our last strep that we want to differentiate, Enterococcus Ficalis. So the genus name is not Streptococcus here. We are considering this a Streptococcus because, excuse me, it's so closely related. In the mid-80s, scientists decided that the Streptococcus genera was too big. They separated it out into the streps that at that time were considered non-pathogenic. So this organism used to be called Streptococcus Ficalis. They renamed it Enterococcus Ficalis. The organisms that now have the genus name Lactococcus were Streptococcus that were found in dairy products, and they were given their own genus as well. So in 1984, this organism was not considered pathogenic, and they gave it its own genus name. But it shares so many characteristics with Streptococcus that we're going to group it together with Strep here. So Enterococcus is part of your normal microbiota in the GI tract. So mostly your large intestine. And that's unusual really for a gram-positive organism to be there. Most of the time gram-positives don't survive passing through the stomach, but this one does. Okay, so this organism typically is not going to cause a problem when it's in your large intestine. If a patient gets a perforated bowel or, say, is stabbed and that organism, leaks out where it doesn't belong, then yes, it's going to cause some huge problems. This organism, as well as there's a few other Enterococcus as well, are associated with hospital-acquired infections. Okay, so they're considered opportunists. That means they typically aren't going to cause disease unless a kind of a specific opportunity arises. So somebody has surgery. There are some strains of Enterococcus Ficalis that are causing huge problems because they are resistant to so many antibiotics. Okay, there's a strain that we abbreviate VRE, that stands for Vancomycin resistant Enterococci. Vancomycin is typically our antibiotic of last resort for gram-positive infections, and when you have an organism that's even resistant to vancomycin, then that's considered a medical emergency. Okay. All right, so in the next video, we'll talk about what you're going to actually inoculate and a little bit more about how we organize our Streptococcus.